Pirates lived by their own code. But what if you broke it? The punishments were brutal, terrifying, and sometimes surprisingly fair. Picture this. You're aboard a pirate ship in 1720, somewhere in the Caribbean. The sun is blazing overhead, the deck is slick with salt spray, and you've just made the worst mistake of your life. Maybe you stole from a shipmate's share of treasure. Maybe you struck another crew member in anger. Maybe you refused to fight when the call came to battle. Whatever you did, you've broken the sacred code that governs life aboard this floating republic of outlaws. Now you stand before your fellow pirates, not as their equal, but as their prisoner. They form a circle around you, their faces grim and unforgiving. These are men who have chosen to live outside the law, who have rejected the authority of kings and governors, who have embraced a life of violence and plunder. But they are not without their own sense of justice. What happens next will not be decided by the whim of a captain, or the arbitrary judgment of an officer. Instead, your fate will be determined by a code of laws that was written and agreed upon by every man aboard this ship, a set of rules that governs everything from the division of treasure to the punishment of crimes. You are about to experience pirate justice in all its terrible and fascinating complexity. The pirate code wasn't just a romantic notion invented by Hollywood screenwriters. It was a real and vital institution that governed the lives of thousands of pirates during the golden age of piracy in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. These codes, also known as Articles of Agreement, were formal documents that every pirate was required to sign before joining a crew. They were constitutions in the truest sense, establishing not just the rules of shipboard life, but the procedures for enforcing those rules and the punishments for breaking them. To understand pirate justice, you must first understand the world from which it emerged. The seas of the early 1700s were a lawless frontier, where traditional authorities had little power and where survival depended on the ability to organize effective fighting forces. Pirate ships were not just vessels of war and plunder. They were floating societies that needed their own systems of government, their own methods of resolving disputes, and their own mechanisms for maintaining order. The men who became pirates came from every level of society, but they shared certain common experiences. Many had served in legitimate navies, where they had witnessed the arbitrary brutality of officers who held absolute power over their subordinates. Others had worked on merchant ships, where captains treated common sailors as little better than slaves. Some were escaped slaves themselves, men who had experienced the ultimate in arbitrary power, and who sought a life where their voices would be heard and their rights respected. These men brought with them a deep suspicion of arbitrary authority and a strong desire for justice that was predictable, transparent, and fair. The pirate codes they created reflected these values, establishing systems of law that were often more enlightened than anything found in the legitimate governments of their time. The creation of a pirate code was a democratic process that involved the entire crew. When a new ship was formed, or when an existing crew decided to revise their articles, every man aboard had the right to propose rules and to vote on the final document. The resulting code would address every aspect of shipboard life, from the most mundane details of daily routine to the most serious questions of crime and punishment. A typical pirate code might include provisions governing the division of treasure, with specific shares allocated to the captain, the quartermaster, and ordinary crew members. It would establish rules for conduct during battle, requirements for maintaining weapons and equipment, and procedures for making collective decisions. Most importantly for our purposes, it would contain a comprehensive criminal code that specified exactly what constituted a crime aboard the ship and what punishment each crime would receive. These criminal codes were remarkably sophisticated documents that reflected a deep understanding of human nature and the requirements of shipboard discipline. They recognized that certain behaviors that might be tolerable on land could be fatal at sea, where the survival of the entire crew might depend on the reliability and loyalty of every individual member. Theft from a shipmate, for example, was considered one of the most serious crimes a pirate could commit. This wasn't just because stealing was morally wrong, but because it threatened the very foundation of pirate society. Pirates operated on a principle of shared risk and shared reward. Every man who participated in a raid was entitled to his fair share of whatever was captured. If crew members couldn't trust each other to respect this principle, the entire system would collapse. Similarly, cowardice in battle was not just a personal failing, but a threat to the survival of everyone aboard the ship. When a pirate vessel engaged an enemy, every man needed to fight with absolute determination, knowing that his shipmates would do the same. A single coward who failed to do his duty could tip the balance in a close fight, potentially dooming his entire crew to death or capture. The pirate codes addressed these concerns by establishing clear, specific punishments for various crimes. These punishments were designed not just to exact retribution on wrongdoers, but to deter future crimes and to maintain the discipline and loyalty that were essential for the crew's survival. The enforcement of pirate justice was as democratic as its creation. When a crew member was accused of breaking the code, he was entitled to a trial before the entire crew. This wasn't a formal court proceeding in the modern sense, but it was a genuine attempt to determine guilt or innocence, and to ensure that punishment was administered fairly and according to the established rules. The accused had the right to speak in his own defense, to present evidence of his innocence, and to call upon his shipmates to testify on his behalf. The crew would hear all the evidence and then vote on whether the accused was guilty of the charges against him. If they found him guilty, they would then determine what punishment should be imposed, always within the guidelines established by their Articles of Agreement. This system of collective justice was revolutionary for its time. In the legitimate world of the early 18th century, justice was typically administered by individuals with absolute authority: kings, nobles, or their appointed representatives. Common people had no voice in the creation of laws and no protection from the arbitrary exercise of power. A naval captain could have a sailor flogged or hanged on his own authority, with no trial and no appeal. Pirate justice, by contrast, was based on the principle that every man had the right to be judged by his peers, according to laws that he had helped to create. This wasn't just a more humane approach to justice. It was a more effective one. Pirates who knew that they would be treated fairly were more likely to accept the authority of their officers and to fight loyally for their crew. The punishments specified in pirate codes ranged from relatively mild sanctions to penalties that were as severe as any imposed by legitimate governments. The severity of the punishment typically reflected both the seriousness of the crime and the practical requirements of maintaining discipline and order aboard the ship. For minor infractions, pirates might face punishments that were designed more to humiliate than to harm. A pirate who was caught drunk on duty, for example, might be forced to wear women's clothing for a day, or might have his daily ration of rum reduced for a week. These punishments served as public reminders of the importance of following the rules, while allowing the offender to remain a productive member of the crew. More serious crimes called for more serious punishments, and it is here that pirate justice revealed both its fairness and its brutality. The pirates who created these codes understood that their survival depended on maintaining absolute discipline in certain crucial areas, and they were prepared to impose terrible punishments on those who threatened the welfare of the crew. Marooning was perhaps the most feared punishment in the pirate arsenal, and it was reserved for the most serious offences: desertion in battle, theft from the common fund, or betrayal of the crew to its enemies. The condemned man would be put ashore on a deserted island with minimal supplies. Typically a bottle of water, a small amount of food, a pistol with a single shot, and perhaps a Bible if the crew was feeling generous. The psychological impact of marooning was as terrible as its physical consequences. The victim would watch helplessly as his ship sailed away, leaving him alone with the knowledge that he would almost certainly die on that desolate shore. The single pistol shot was intended as a mercy, allowing the marooned pirate to end his own suffering when starvation, thirst, or despair became unbearable. Yet even this most severe of punishments was administered according to strict rules and procedures. The decision to maroon a crew member had to be approved by a majority vote of the entire crew, and the condemned man was entitled to speak in his own defense before the sentence was carried out. In some cases, crews would commute a marooning sentence to a lesser punishment if the accused could demonstrate genuine remorse or if circumstances had changed since the crime was committed. The case of Captain Charles Vane illustrates both the severity and the fairness of pirate justice. Vane was a successful pirate captain who commanded the respect of his crew through his courage and his skill at capturing prizes. However, in November 1718, Vane made a decision that his crew considered an act of cowardice. When Vane's ship encountered a French man-of-war off the coast of South Carolina, the captain decided to avoid a fight, arguing that the enemy vessel was too well armed for them to attack safely. His crew, however, believed that they could have taken the ship if they had shown proper courage and determination. They saw Vane's retreat not as prudent seamanship, but as a violation of the pirate code that required every man to fight bravely. When the opportunity for plunder presented itself, the crew called for a vote of no confidence in their captain, and when Vane lost that vote, they deposed him from his position and elected a new leader. But they didn't stop there. They also voted to maroon Vane and his few remaining supporters on a small island in the Bahamas, arguing that his cowardice had cost them a valuable prize and had dishonored the crew. Vane's marooning was carried out according to proper procedures. He was given a small boat, some supplies, and the opportunity to take any crew members who wished to remain loyal to him. He was also allowed to speak in his own defense, though his arguments failed to sway his former shipmates. The sentence was harsh, but it was administered fairly and according to the rules that Vane himself had agreed to follow when he joined the pirate crew. Flogging was another common form of pirate punishment, typically reserved for offences that were serious enough to require physical punishment, but not so severe as to warrant marooning or execution. A pirate who started a fight with a shipmate who was repeatedly drunk on duty, or who failed to maintain his weapons, might face a sentence of lashes to be administered in front of the entire crew. The number of lashes would be specified in advance, typically ranging from a dozen for minor offences to several hundred for more serious crimes. The flogging would be carried out by the ship's boatswain or by another crew member appointed for the task, using a cat-o'-nine-tails or a similar multi-tailed whip designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation. Like marooning, flogging served multiple purposes beyond simple punishment. It provided a public demonstration of the consequences of breaking the pirate code, reinforcing the importance of following the rules in the minds of all crew members. It also allowed the offender to pay for his crime and return to full membership in the crew. rather than being permanently expelled or executed. The public nature of flogging was crucial to its effectiveness. The entire crew would be assembled to witness the punishment, and the charges against the condemned man would be read aloud before the sentence was carried out. This ensured that everyone understood exactly what behavior was being punished, and what consequences they could expect if they committed similar offenses. Yet, even in the administration of physical punishment, pirate justice showed a concern for fairness that was often absent from legitimate legal systems. The number of lashes was fixed in advance and could not be increased at the whim of the person administering the punishment. The condemned man had the right to have his case reviewed by the crew if he believed that the sentence was unjust, and in some cases, crews would reduce or suspend sentences if they believed that the offender had learned his lesson or if circumstances had changed. Execution was the ultimate punishment in the pirate arsenal, reserved for crimes that threatened the very survival of the crew. Murder of a shipmate, treason against the ship, or leading a mutiny against properly constituted authority might all result in a sentence of death. Like other forms of pirate punishment, execution was carried out according to established procedures and only after a trial before the entire crew. The methods of execution varied depending on the preferences of the individual crew and the nature of the crime. Hanging was the most common form, often carried out from the ship's yardarm in full view of the assembled crew. Shooting was also used, sometimes as a form of military execution for crimes related to cowardice or desertion. In extreme cases, condemned pirates might be thrown overboard to drown, though this method was less common because it was considered less honorable than other forms of execution. The decision to execute a crew member was never taken lightly. Pirates understood that they were operating with limited manpower, and that every able-bodied sailor was valuable to the success of their enterprise. The loss of even one crew member through execution weakened the ship's fighting capability and reduced its chances of capturing future prizes. For this reason, execution was typically reserved for crimes that made it impossible for the offender to remain a trusted member of the crew. A pirate who had murdered a shipmate could not be allowed to continue living among men who might be his next victims. A traitor who had attempted to betray the crew to their enemies could never again be trusted with information about the ship's plans and movements. The case of Israel Hands, one of Blackbeard's lieutenants, illustrates the complexities of pirate justice and the circumstances that might lead to a death sentence. Hands was a trusted member of Blackbeard's crew and had served as second in command on several successful raids. However, during a drinking session aboard ship, Hands became involved in an argument with another crew member that escalated into violence. In the fight that followed, Hands drew his pistol and shot his opponent, killing him instantly. This was clearly a case of murder, one of the most serious crimes recognized by the Pirate Code. Under normal circumstances, Hands would have faced certain execution for his actions. However, his case was complicated by several factors that the crew had to consider. First, Hands was an experienced and valuable sailor whose loss would significantly weaken the crew's fighting capability. Second, the killing had occurred during a drunken brawl, rather than as a premeditated act of murder. Third, Hands expressed genuine remorse for his actions and was supported by several crew members who testified to his good character and his previous service to the ship. After considerable debate, the crew decided to spare Hands' life, but to impose a severe alternative punishment. He was sentenced to be marooned on a deserted island, a punishment that was nearly as severe as execution, but that offered at least some chance of survival. The decision reflected the crew's attempt to balance the demands of justice with practical considerations about the ship's welfare. Dueling was a unique form of pirate justice that served both as punishment and as a method of resolving disputes between crew members. When two pirates had a serious disagreement that could not be settled through normal means, they might be required to fight a formal duel to determine the winner and to prevent their dispute from disrupting the harmony of the crew. Pirate duels were typically fought with pistols, though swords were sometimes used depending on the preferences of the combatants and the traditions of the particular crew. The rules were strictly enforced. The duelists would stand back to back, take a predetermined number of paces, turn, and fire on command. The survivor would be considered the winner of the dispute, while the loser would pay the ultimate price for his position. From a modern perspective, dueling might seem like a barbaric way to resolve disputes, but it served several important functions in pirate society. First, it provided a way to settle serious disagreements before they could escalate into larger conflicts that might tear the crew apart. Second, it ensured that both parties had an equal chance to defend their position, since both faced the same risk of death. Third, it satisfied the crew's sense of honor and justice by allowing disputed matters to be settled through trial by combat. The formal nature of pirate dueling was crucial to its effectiveness as a form of justice. Duels could not be fought on impulse or in the heat of anger. They had to be approved by the crew and conducted according to established rules. This gave both parties time to consider whether their dispute was serious enough to risk their lives over, and it ensured that the duel would be conducted fairly and without outside interference. In many cases, the formal challenge to a duel would lead to a negotiated settlement of the dispute, as both parties realized that their disagreement was not worth dying for. When duels were actually fought, they served as powerful reminders to the entire crew about the importance of resolving conflicts before they became irreconcilable. The loss of shares in captured prizes was a form of economic punishment that was particularly effective in pirate society, where material wealth was the primary motivation for most crew members. A pirate who committed a minor offense might lose a portion of his share in the next prize, while more serious crimes might result in the complete forfeiture of all economic benefits for a specified period. This form of punishment was especially appropriate for crimes that had economic dimensions, such as gambling with the ship's money, failing to maintain equipment properly, or violating rules about the distribution of captured goods. It allowed the crew to impose meaningful consequences for wrongdoing, while keeping the offender as a productive member of the ship's company. The loss of shares also served as a form of restitution for the crew as a whole. When a pirate's misconduct cost the ship money or opportunities for profit, the forfeiture of his share helped to compensate his shipmates for their losses. This created a direct connection between the crime and its consequences, reinforcing the principle that individual actions had collective consequences in the tight-knit world of a pirate crew. Some pirate crews employed more exotic forms of punishment that were designed to shame offenders, while making them examples for the rest of the crew. Disfigurement was one such punishment, typically involving the cutting off of ears, noses, or other body parts as a permanent mark of the offender's crime. These punishments served multiple purposes. They provided immediate physical consequences for wrongdoing. They created permanent reminders of the importance of following the pirate code, and they marked the offender in ways that would be visible to members of other crews, serving as warnings about his past misconduct. However, disfigurement was used sparingly by most pirate crews, both because of its permanent nature and because it could reduce the effectiveness of the punished individual as a fighting man. A pirate who had lost an ear or a finger was still capable of doing his job, but more severe disfigurement might make him a liability in battle or in other dangerous situations. The use of such punishments also reflected the cultural backgrounds of the pirates themselves. Many had served in legitimate navies where similar punishments were common, and they brought these practices with them into their pirate careers. However, the democratic nature of pirate justice meant that such extreme punishments could only be imposed with the approval of the entire crew, providing a check against the arbitrary brutality that was common in more hierarchical organizations. When we compare pirate justice to the legal systems of the early 18th century, the contrast is striking and often favorable to the pirates. In legitimate society, justice was typically administered by individuals with absolute power, who were accountable to no one but their superiors in the social hierarchy. A king could order executions on a whim, a nobleman could have peasants flogged for imagined slights, and military officers could impose brutal punishments on their subordinates, without any review or appeal. Pirates, by contrast, had created legal systems that were based on the consent of the governed and that provided significant protections for the rights of individuals. Every pirate knew exactly what behavior was prohibited and what punishment each offense would bring. No one could be punished without a trial before his peers, and every sentence had to be approved by a majority vote of the crew. This is not to say that pirate justice was perfect or that it would meet modern standards of due process and human rights. Pirates lived in a violent world where brutal punishments were often necessary to maintain the discipline required for survival. Their legal systems reflected this reality and were designed more for effectiveness than for mercy. However, within the constraints of their time and circumstances, pirates had created remarkably fair and democratic systems of justice. A common sailor who faced charges aboard a pirate ship could expect to receive more procedural protections and more humane treatment than he would in most legitimate courts of the era. The Royal Navy, which was the primary opponent of Caribbean pirates, provided a stark contrast to pirate justice in its arbitrariness and brutality. Naval officers had virtually unlimited authority over their crews and could impose punishments ranging from flogging to hanging with little or no oversight. Sailors had no voice in the creation of the rules that governed them, and no protection from the arbitrary exercise of authority by their superiors. Flogging was routine in the Royal Navy, often administered for minor infractions such as talking back to an officer or failing to move quickly enough when given an order. The number of lashes was left to the discretion of the commanding officer, and there was no appeal from his decision. Sailors could be flogged dozens or even hundreds of times for offenses that would have received much milder treatment aboard a pirate ship. Hanging was also common in the Royal Navy, particularly for offenses related to desertion or mutiny. Naval courts-martial were typically perfunctory affairs, where the outcome was predetermined and where the accused had little opportunity to defend himself. The contrast with pirate trials, where every crew member could speak and vote on the outcome, was dramatic. Perhaps most importantly, Royal Navy discipline was based on fear rather than consent. Sailors obeyed their officers not because they believed in the justice of the system, but because they were afraid of the consequences of disobedience. This created an atmosphere of resentment and hostility that often exploded into mutinies and other forms of resistance. Pirate discipline, while equally strict in its own way, was based on the principle that crew members had agreed to follow certain rules in exchange for their share in the ship's profits and their voice in its governance. This created a very different psychological dynamic, one based on mutual obligation rather than simple domination. The contrast between pirate justice and the legal systems of European monarchies was equally striking. In most European countries of the early 18th century, the law was an instrument of royal power rather than a protection for individual rights. Kings and their representatives could arrest, try, and execute subjects with minimal procedural protections and often for political reasons that had nothing to do with actual criminal behavior. Torture was commonly used to extract confessions. Trials were often conducted in secret, and the accused had little opportunity to defend themselves or to challenge the evidence against them. Punishments were severe and often deliberately cruel, designed more to demonstrate royal power than to achieve any rational purpose of deterrence or rehabilitation. Class distinctions played a major role in the administration of justice, with nobles receiving much more lenient treatment than commoners for the same offences. A gentleman who killed a peasant might face no punishment at all, while a peasant who struck a nobleman could expect to be hanged or worse. Pirates, by contrast, had created legal systems that were explicitly egalitarian. Every crew member, regardless of his background or previous status, was entitled to the same protections and subject to the same rules. A former slave and a former gentleman would receive identical treatment if they committed the same offense, and both would have equal voices in determining the fate of an accused shipmate. This egalitarian approach to justice was revolutionary for its time and reflected the broader democratic principles that governed pirate society. Pirates had rejected not just the political authority of kings and governors, but the entire social hierarchy that legitimized unequal treatment under the law. The famous pirate Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, created one of the most detailed and sophisticated pirate codes of his era, and his approach to justice illustrates both the fairness and the severity of pirate legal systems. Roberts' Articles of Agreement contained 11 specific provisions, governing everything from the division of treasure to the conduct of romantic relationships. Article V of Roberts' Code stated that no boy or woman to be allowed amongst them. If any man were to be found seducing any of the latter sex, and carried her to sea, disguised, he was to suffer death. This provision reflected the practical recognition that the presence of women aboard ship could create jealousies and conflicts that would be destructive to crew discipline. Article the 9th provided that no man to talk of breaking up their way of living till each had shared £1,000. If in order to this, any man should lose a limb or become a cripple in their service, he was to have $800 out of the public stock, and for lesser hurts, proportionably. This article established both a disability insurance system and a prohibition against desertion that would be enforced through the ship's justice system. Roberts' Code also established specific punishments for various offences. Theft from the common stock was punishable by marooning. Fighting between crew members was to be settled by formal dueling on shore. Desertion from battle was punishable by death or marooning at the discretion of the crew. What made Roberts' system remarkable was its combination of severity and predictability. Every crew member knew exactly what behavior was expected of him and what consequences he would face if he failed to meet those expectations. There was no arbitrary punishment, no favoritism based on personal relationships, and no changing of the rules to suit the convenience of those in power. Roberts himself was subject to the same code that governed his crew, and on at least one occasion he faced formal charges for violating the Articles of Agreement, when some of his crew accused him of keeping more than his fair share of captured treasure. Roberts submitted to a trial before the entire crew and was acquitted only after presenting evidence that he had distributed the loot according to the established formula. This willingness of pirate captains to submit to the judgment of their crews was another remarkable feature of pirate justice. In legitimate society, rulers were above the law and could not be held accountable for their actions by their subjects. Pirate captains, by contrast, were bound by the same rules that applied to everyone else, and could be punished if they violated those rules. The enforcement of pirate justice required a sophisticated understanding of group psychology and social dynamics. Pirates had to maintain discipline and order among men who had rejected all conventional authority and who were accustomed to solving their problems through violence. The challenge was to create systems of punishment that would deter misconduct without destroying the democratic spirit that held pirate crews together. The solution was to make punishment a collective responsibility rather than an individual prerogative. No single person, not even the captain, had the authority to impose punishment on his own. Every significant disciplinary action had to be approved by the crew as a whole, ensuring that punishments reflected the collective will of the community, rather than the arbitrary decisions of those in power. This collective approach to punishment served several important functions. First, it ensured that disciplinary actions had the legitimacy that came from democratic approval. A pirate who was punished by vote of his shipmates was more likely to accept that punishment as just than one who was punished by the arbitrary decision of an officer. Second, it distributed the moral responsibility for punishment among all members of the crew. No single individual had to bear the psychological burden of deciding life and death questions, and no one could be accused of acting from personal motives or favoritism. Third, it served as an educational function for the entire crew. Every trial and punishment was a reminder of the rules that governed shipboard life and the consequences of violating those rules. The public nature of pirate justice ensured that every crew member understood both his rights and his responsibilities as a member of the pirate community. The psychological impact of public trials and punishments was carefully calculated to achieve maximum deterrent effect. When a pirate was accused of a serious crime, the entire crew would assemble to hear the evidence and to participate in the decision-making process. This created a powerful sense of collective involvement in the administration of justice and reinforced the principle that every crew member had both rights and responsibilities within the pirate community. The accused had the right to speak in his own defense and to present evidence of his innocence. This wasn't just a formality. There are documented cases where pirates were acquitted after presenting convincing defenses, or where punishments were reduced after mitigating evidence was presented. However, the burden of proof in pirate trials was typically lower than in modern legal systems. Pirates operated in a dangerous environment where the consequences of misconduct could be catastrophic for the entire crew. They could not afford to give accused wrongdoers the benefit of every doubt, especially when the survival of the ship might depend on maintaining absolute discipline and loyalty. The speed of pirate justice was another distinctive feature that reflected the practical requirements of life at sea. Unlike land-based legal systems, which could afford lengthy deliberations and complex procedures, pirate crews needed to resolve disciplinary matters quickly, so that they could return their attention to the business of piracy. Most pirate trials were completed within a few hours, or at most, a day or two. The evidence was presented, the accused was allowed to speak in his defense, and the crew voted on guilt or innocence and on the appropriate punishment. This swift resolution served both practical and psychological purposes, ensuring that disciplinary matters did not disrupt the ship's operations, while also providing immediate consequences for misconduct. The finality of pirate justice was both its strength and its weakness. Once a crew had voted on a punishment, there was typically no appeal and no opportunity for reconsideration. This created strong incentives for careful deliberation before voting. but it also meant that mistakes could not easily be corrected. However, the collective nature of pirate decision-making provided some protection against errors and injustices. It was much less likely that an entire crew would make a serious mistake than that a single individual would act arbitrarily or unfairly. The requirement for majority approval also meant that punishments had to have broad support among the crew, reducing the likelihood of decisions based on personal animosity or factional disputes. The role of the ship's quartermaster in administering pirate justice was crucial to the fairness and effectiveness of the system. The quartermaster was typically elected by the crew and served as a combination of police chief, prosecutor, and judge advocate. He was responsible for investigating alleged crimes, presenting evidence to the crew, and ensuring that trials were conducted fairly and according to established procedures. The quartermaster's position was one of great responsibility and considerable danger. He had to be trusted by the crew to investigate crimes impartially, and to present evidence accurately, even when that evidence might implicate popular crew members, or when the crimes involved complicated personal relationships. At the same time, the quartermaster had to maintain his own position within the democratic structure of the ship. If the crew lost confidence in his fairness or competence, he could be voted out of office just as easily as any other ship's officer. This created strong incentives for quartermasters to administer justice impartially and according to established rules rather than personal preferences. The relationship between the quartermaster and the captain was also crucial to the effective administration of pirate justice. While the captain had supreme authority during battles and other emergencies, the quartermaster typically took the lead in disciplinary matters. This division of responsibility helped to ensure that justice was not influenced by the captain's personal relationships with crew members, or by his interest in maintaining popularity among the men he led. In some cases, captains and quartermasters disagreed about disciplinary matters, creating complex political situations that had to be resolved through the ship's democratic processes. These disagreements were often settled by crew votes, with the majority decision becoming binding on both officers. The international character of many pirate crews created additional complications for the administration of justice. A typical pirate ship might include men from England, France, Spain, Portugal, Holland, various African nations, and several American colonies, each bringing their own cultural expectations about law and punishment. Pirates had to create justice systems that could accommodate this cultural diversity, while maintaining the unity and discipline that were essential for the crew's survival. This typically meant adopting relatively simple and universal principles that could be understood and accepted by men from very different backgrounds. The common experience of maritime life provided one unifying factor, regardless of their cultural backgrounds. Most pirates had served aboard ships before and understood the basic requirements of shipboard discipline. The harsh realities of life at sea created a shared understanding of what behaviors were dangerous to the crew and what punishments were necessary to maintain order. Religious differences were another potential source of conflict that pirate justice systems had to address. Many pirate crews included Christians of various denominations, Muslims, Jews, and followers of African traditional religions. Pirates typically resolved these differences by adopting a pragmatic approach to religious questions, focusing on behavior rather than beliefs, and avoiding punishments that would violate the religious sensibilities of significant portions of the crew. The linguistic diversity of pirate crews also created challenges for the administration of justice. Trials had to be conducted in ways that ensured all crew members could understand the proceedings, even when they spoke different languages. This often meant using interpreters or conducting parts of the trial in multiple languages. Despite these challenges, pirate crews were remarkably successful at creating justice systems that could function effectively across cultural and linguistic boundaries. This success reflected both the practical wisdom of the pirates themselves and the unifying power of their shared commitment to democratic principles and mutual survival. The temporary nature of many pirate crews created additional pressures on their justice systems. Unlike permanent communities that could afford to take time working through complex legal problems, pirate crews often had to resolve disciplinary matters quickly before the crew disbanded or before external pressures forced them to separate. This temporal constraint encouraged the development of justice systems that were simple, direct, and effective. Pirates could not afford the luxury of lengthy deliberations or complex legal procedures. They needed systems that could quickly distinguish between guilt and innocence, and that could impose appropriate punishments without destroying the unity of the crew. The knowledge that the crew might separate at any time also influenced the types of punishments that were practical to impose. Long-term penalties, such as imprisonment, were not feasible when the ship might need to divide its crew, or when individual pirates might choose to leave and join other crews. This encouraged the use of immediate punishments such as flogging or permanent penalties such as marooning or execution. The economic incentives that drove pirate behavior also shaped their approach to justice. Pirates were primarily motivated by the desire for wealth, and their justice systems had to take this motivation into account. Punishments that threatened a pirate's share in captured prizes were often more effective deterrents than physical punishments, since they struck directly at the economic motives that had led men to become pirates in the first place. The division of labor aboard pirate ships also influenced the administration of justice. Unlike land-based communities, where specialized legal officials could devote their full attention to judicial matters, pirate crews had to integrate legal functions with the practical requirements of sailing and fighting. This meant that trials and punishments had to be scheduled around the ship's operational needs, and that legal officers had to be capable sailors and fighters as well as judges and administrators. The weapons and tools available aboard ship also shaped the forms of punishment that were practical to implement. Flogging could be administered using ropes and whips that were already aboard ship for sailing purposes. Marooning required only a small boat and some basic supplies. Execution could be carried out using the ship's firearms or by hanging from the rigging. More elaborate forms of punishment that might have been used on land were impractical at sea. Pirates could not build jails, or stocks could not impose fines in money that they did not possess, and could not sentence offenders to hard labor that was different from the work that every crew member already performed as part of his regular duties. The isolation of pirate ships from legitimate legal systems also influenced their approach to justice. Pirates could not turn serious offenders over to civil authorities, could not call upon external forces to help maintain order, and could not threaten troublemakers with prosecution in legitimate courts. This self-reliance forced them to develop comprehensive systems of justice that could handle every type of crime and dispute that might arise within their floating communities. The reputation of individual pirate crews for fair or harsh justice became an important factor in their ability to recruit new members and maintain the loyalty of existing ones. Pirates talked among themselves when they met in ports and taverns, sharing stories about the treatment they had received aboard different ships. A crew that was known for arbitrary or excessive punishment would find it difficult to attract quality recruits, while a crew with a reputation for fair dealing would have its pick of experienced sailors. This market-based pressure for fair treatment created strong incentives for pirate crews to develop and maintain justice systems that would be viewed favorably by the broader pirate community. It was not enough for a crew's justice system to maintain internal discipline. It also had to meet the expectations of the external community from which new crew members would be drawn. The documentation of pirate codes and justice systems was another remarkable feature that distinguished them from many other forms of outlaw organization. Many pirate crews took care to write down their articles of agreement and to preserve records of important trials and punishments. This documentation served several purposes. It provided clear guidance for future cases. It demonstrated the crew's commitment to rule of law rather than arbitrary power. And it served as evidence of the crew's democratic character for potential recruits. Some of these documents have survived to the present day, providing invaluable insights into the actual operation of pirate justice systems. The articles of Bartholomew Roberts, John Phillips, and other famous pirates give us detailed pictures of how these communities governed themselves and how they balanced individual rights with collective security. The literacy requirements for maintaining these written codes also influenced the composition of pirate crews. While many pirates were illiterate, every successful crew needed at least some members who could read and write well enough to maintain their legal documents and conduct their trials according to established procedures. This created opportunities for educated men who might otherwise have been excluded from pirate society because of their background or social class. The influence of national legal traditions on pirate justice varied considerably depending on the backgrounds of crew members and the circumstances under which particular crews were formed. English pirates often brought with them traditions of common law and trial by jury, while Spanish pirates might be more familiar with civil law systems based on written codes. French pirates brought their own legal traditions, as did pirates from other European nations. However, the practical requirements of shipboard life tended to override these national differences, creating hybrid systems that combined elements from various legal traditions while adapting them to the unique circumstances of pirate society. The result was a form of legal pluralism that was remarkably sophisticated for its time and place. African pirates and former slaves brought their own concepts of justice and community decision-making to pirate crews. Many African legal traditions emphasized collective responsibility and restorative rather than punitive approaches to crime. These influences can be seen in some pirate practices, such as the emphasis on crew votes for major decisions and the preference for punishments that restored balance to the community, rather than simply inflicting pain on wrongdoers. The seasonal nature of much pirate activity also influenced the administration of justice. Many pirates operated only during certain times of year, when weather conditions were favorable and when merchant shipping was most active. During the off-season, crews might disband temporarily, with members going their separate ways until the next sailing season began. This seasonal pattern created unique challenges for maintaining continuity in legal proceedings. Crimes committed near the end of a season might have to be dealt with quickly before the crew separated, while offenses that occurred early in the season might have their resolution delayed by the practical requirements of the pirate campaign. Some crews addressed this problem by establishing winter courts that would convene when the crew reassembled for the next season. These delayed trials required careful documentation and witness testimony that could be preserved during the months when the crew was separated. The complexity of these arrangements demonstrates the seriousness with which pirates approached their legal responsibilities. The relationship between pirate justice and the broader legal culture of the Atlantic world was complex and multifaceted. While pirates rejected the authority of legitimate governments, they could not entirely escape the influence of the legal systems in which many of them had been raised. Pirate codes often incorporated elements from English common law, Spanish colonial law, Dutch commercial law, and other established legal traditions. At the same time, pirates innovated freely when existing legal concepts proved inadequate for their circumstances. The result was a unique synthesis that combined the best features of various legal systems while adapting them to the democratic and egalitarian principles that governed pirate society. The geographic mobility of pirate crews also influenced their approach to justice. Unlike settled communities that could develop legal traditions over generations, pirate crews had to create effective justice systems quickly and adapt them to changing circumstances as they moved from place to place. This required a high degree of flexibility and pragmatism that is evident in the various pirate codes that have survived. The multiracial character of many pirate crews created both challenges and opportunities for the development of fair justice systems. Pirates had to find ways to resolve disputes and administer punishment that would be acceptable to crew members from very different cultural backgrounds and with very different experiences of law and authority. The success of pirate crews in creating integrated communities where former slaves and former masters could work together as equals was unprecedented in the 18th century. This integration was made possible partly by the shared dangers and rewards of pirate life. But it also required sophisticated approaches to justice that could transcend racial and cultural boundaries. The role of violence in pirate justice was both more and less prominent than might be expected. While pirates certainly used violent punishments when they deemed them necessary, their justice systems were also designed to prevent unnecessary violence within the crew. By providing fair and predictable procedures for resolving disputes, pirate codes helped to channel the violent tendencies of crew members in constructive rather than destructive directions. The ritualized nature of much pirate punishment also served to contain and control violence. Floggings, executions, and even duels were conducted according to strict procedures that limited the scope of violence and ensured that it served the interests of the community rather than simply expressing personal animosity. The psychological effects of pirate justice on crew members were profound and lasting. Pirates who lived under fair and predictable legal systems developed strong loyalties to their crews and fierce commitments to the democratic principles that governed their communities. These psychological bonds were essential to the success of pirate enterprises and help explain why pirate crews could often outfight larger and better equipped opponents. The sense of ownership and participation that came from democratic involvement in the creation and administration of law gave pirates a stake in their community's success that went far beyond simple economic interest. They were not just employees or subordinates. They were citizen participants in a democratic experiment that gave them dignity and agency in ways that legitimate society never could. The educational function of pirate justice extended beyond simple deterrence to include positive lessons about citizenship and community responsibility. Pirates learned through participation in trials and punishment that their individual actions had consequences for the entire crew, and that they had both rights and responsibilities as members of their floating democracy. These lessons often proved valuable to pirates who eventually left piracy for legitimate occupations. Former pirates frequently became leaders in frontier communities, where their experience with democratic decision-making and collective problem-solving made them valuable citizens. The skills they had learned in administering pirate justice translated well to the challenges of building new communities in unsettled territories. The timing and scheduling of pirate trials reflected the practical realities of life aboard ship. Serious disciplinary matters had to be resolved quickly to prevent them from disrupting the crew's operational effectiveness. But trials could not be conducted during battles, storms, or other emergencies when all hands were needed for immediate tasks. Most pirate trials were held during relatively calm periods, when the ship was at anchor or when sailing conditions permitted the crew to assemble safely on deck. The timing of these proceedings was itself a form of ceremony that emphasized the importance and solemnity of the occasion. The physical setting for pirate trials was also carefully chosen to maximize their psychological impact. Trials were typically held on deck in full view of the assembled crew, with the accused standing before his shipmates in a position that emphasized both his vulnerability and the collective nature of the judgment he faced. The formality of these proceedings contrasted sharply with the informal atmosphere that prevailed during most shipboard activities. This contrast served to emphasize the seriousness of the occasion and the importance of the principles at stake. Pirates understood instinctively that justice required ceremony and ritual to maintain its authority and effectiveness. The preservation of evidence for pirate trials was a complex undertaking that required considerable organization and foresight. Physical evidence had to be secured and protected in an environment where space was limited, and where the ship's movements could easily damage or destroy fragile materials. Witness testimony had to be collected and preserved in ways that would ensure its accuracy and reliability. Some pirate crews appointed specific individuals to serve as record keepers for legal proceedings, recognizing that accurate documentation was essential to fair trials. These men were responsible for maintaining the ship's legal records and for ensuring that evidence was properly preserved and presented during trials. The cross-examination of witnesses in pirate trials was often conducted by the accused himself. Since pirates rarely had access to trained legal advocates, this self-representation required considerable courage and skill, since the accused had to challenge the testimony of his shipmates while maintaining their respect and avoiding the appearance of disrespect for the legal process. The ability to conduct effective self-defense in pirate trials became a valued skill that enhanced a pirate's reputation and standing within the crew. Pirates who could articulate their positions clearly and persuasively were more likely to receive fair treatment, and were often chosen for leadership positions within their crews. The deliberation process in pirate trials varied considerably depending on the complexity of the case and the traditions of the particular crew. Some crews conducted open debates where every member could express his opinion before voting, while others used more structured procedures that limited discussion to designated speakers. The voting procedures used in pirate trials were designed to ensure that every crew member's voice was heard, while preventing any individual from dominating the proceedings. Secret ballots were sometimes used when crews feared that open voting might lead to intimidation or retaliation. Though most pirate trials concluded with public votes that demonstrated the collective will of the crew, the announcement of verdicts in pirate trials was typically accompanied by explanations of the reasoning behind the crew's decision. This served several purposes. It demonstrated that the verdict was based on careful consideration of the evidence rather than arbitrary preference. It provided guidance for future cases, and it helped to maintain the legitimacy of the legal process in the eyes of all crew members. The implementation of sentences in pirate trials required careful planning and coordination, especially for severe punishments such as marooning or execution. These sentences had to be carried out in ways that demonstrated the authority of the law, while maintaining the dignity of both the condemned and the community that had judged him. The aftermath of pirate trials often included efforts to heal any divisions that might have been created by the legal proceedings. Crews recognized that trials, however fair, could create lasting resentments that might threaten the unity essential for their survival. Various rituals and practices were used to reintegrate acquitted defendants into the crew and to restore harmony after controversial verdicts. The lessons learned from each trial were typically incorporated into the crew's ongoing legal development. Pirate codes were living documents that could be modified based on experience, and crews regularly updated their articles of agreement to address new situations or to improve their justice systems based on lessons learned from previous cases. The comparison between pirate justice and the legal systems of their contemporaries becomes even more striking when we examine specific cases and outcomes. Take, for example, the treatment of desertion in different contexts. In the British Royal Navy, desertion was punishable by death, and the punishment was often carried out with little regard for the circumstances that might have driven a sailor to abandon his post. Pirates, by contrast, typically distinguished between different types of desertion and imposed punishments accordingly. A pirate who abandoned his post during battle might face marooning or execution, but one who left the crew during peacetime for personal reasons might face only the loss of his share in accumulated prizes. This more nuanced approach reflected the pirates' understanding that justice required consideration of both intent and circumstances. The treatment of theft provides another instructive comparison. In legitimate society, theft was typically punished according to the social status of both the thief and the victim, with harsh penalties reserved for those who stole from their social superiors. Pirates, by contrast, treated theft as a crime against the entire community and punished it according to its impact on the crew's welfare rather than the social standing of those involved. The famous case of Captain William Kidd illustrates the contrast between pirate justice and legitimate legal proceedings. Kidd was originally commissioned by the English government as a privateer, but he was later accused of piracy and brought to trial in London. His trial was conducted according to the formal procedures of English law, but it was widely regarded as a political prosecution designed to satisfy public demand for scapegoats rather than to achieve justice. Kidd was denied access to crucial documents that might have proven his innocence, was not allowed to call important witnesses in his defense, and faced judges who were under political pressure to convict him regardless of the evidence. The contrast with pirate trials, where the accused could speak freely in his own defense and where every crew member could participate in the verdict, was stark and unfavorable to the legitimate legal system. The treatment of violence provides another area where pirate justice often compared favorably to contemporary alternatives. While pirates certainly used violent punishments when they deemed them necessary, their legal systems were also designed to prevent unnecessary violence and to channel aggressive impulses in constructive directions. The dueling system used by many pirate crews provided a regulated outlet for violent disputes that might otherwise have led to uncontrolled fighting and bloodshed. By establishing formal procedures for combat between disputing parties, pirates could resolve conflicts while limiting their destructive impact on the crew as a whole. The case of Edward Lowe, one of the most notorious pirates of the early 18th century, illustrates both the potential and the limitations of pirate justice. Lowe was known for his extreme cruelty toward captured enemies, but his treatment of his own crew was governed by a detailed code that provided significant protections for crew members' rights. Lowe's articles specified exact punishments for various offences and required crew votes for all major disciplinary decisions. However, Lowe's own sadistic tendencies gradually corrupted the justice system aboard his ship, leading to increasingly arbitrary and brutal punishments that ultimately cost him the loyalty of his crew. The case demonstrates that pirate justice systems were only as good as the people who administered them. When crews maintained their commitment to democratic principles and fair dealing, their justice systems could be remarkably effective and humane. However, when psychopathic individuals like Lowe gained control, even the best legal structures could be perverted into instruments of tyranny. The international character of pirate justice created opportunities for cross-cultural learning and legal innovation that were rare in the 18th century. Pirates from different national backgrounds brought various legal traditions to their crews, and the democratic nature of pirate decision-making allowed the best features of these different systems to be combined and adapted. English pirates brought concepts of due process and jury trials. Spanish pirates contributed ideas about written legal codes. French pirates added notions of individual rights, and African pirates shared traditions of community-based justice and collective decision-making. The synthesis of these different approaches produced legal systems that were often more sophisticated and fair than any of their component parts. The role of alcohol in pirate society created special challenges for their justice systems. Pirates consumed large quantities of rum and other alcoholic beverages, and drunkenness was a frequent cause of disputes, fights, and other disciplinary problems. Pirate codes typically addressed these issues by establishing rules about when and how much crew members could drink, and by specifying punishments for alcohol-related offenses. Some crews banned drinking entirely during certain activities such as battles or while on guard duty, while others established elaborate systems for rationing alcohol to prevent excessive consumption. The enforcement of these rules required constant vigilance, and often led to some of the most frequent disciplinary cases that pirate crews had to address. The treatment of captured enemies also fell under the jurisdiction of pirate justice systems, though this area was governed more by practical considerations than by humanitarian concerns. Pirates typically treated captured crews relatively well when cooperation was forthcoming, but they could be brutal toward those who resisted or who were suspected of hiding valuable cargo. The decision of how to treat captives was typically made by the entire crew, rather than left to individual captains, reflecting the democratic principles that governed other aspects of pirate society. This collective responsibility helped to prevent the kinds of gratuitous cruelty that individual sadists might have inflicted, though it did not eliminate violence when pirates believed it was necessary for their survival or success. The economic aspects of pirate justice were closely integrated with the crew systems for dividing captured wealth. Fines and forfeitures were common punishments that served both to penalize wrongdoers and to compensate the crew for losses caused by misconduct. These economic penalties were often more effective than physical punishments in deterring behavior that threatened the crew's welfare. The calculation of economic penalties required sophisticated accounting systems that could track individual shares, calculate compensation for damages, and adjust distributions based on disciplinary decisions. Some pirate crews employed specialists who were responsible for these financial calculations and for ensuring that economic punishments were fairly and accurately assessed. The relationship between pirate justice and maritime law more generally was complex and evolving. Pirates operated outside the jurisdiction of legitimate legal systems, but they could not entirely ignore the legal traditions and practices that governed maritime commerce. Many aspects of pirate law were adaptations of established maritime customs that had been modified to fit the democratic and egalitarian principles of pirate society. The concept of maritime salvage, for example, was transformed by pirates into principles governing the division of captured prizes. Traditional salvage law awarded compensation to those who rescued ships and cargo from danger, while pirate law extended this concept to include the forcible capture of enemy vessels and the democratic distribution of their contents among crew members. The influence of pirate justice on the development of democratic institutions in the Americas has been a subject of considerable historical debate. Some scholars argue that the experience of pirates and former pirates contributed to the democratic movements that emerged in North America during the 18th century, while others contend that any such influence was minimal and indirect. What is clear is that pirates created some of the most egalitarian and democratic communities of their era, and that news of their practices spread throughout the maritime world and beyond. Sailors who had served on pirate ships carried their experiences and knowledge to other contexts, potentially influencing the development of democratic ideas in the communities where they eventually settled. The religious dimensions of pirate justice were generally minimized, reflecting the diverse religious backgrounds of crew members and the practical focus of pirate legal systems. While some pirate codes included religious language and some crews held religious services, the administration of justice was typically based on secular rather than religious principles. This secular approach to law was unusual for the 18th century, when most legal systems were closely connected to religious institutions and when religious authorities played major roles in the administration of justice. The separation of law and religion in pirate society prefigured later developments in democratic legal systems and demonstrated that effective justice could be administered without reliance on religious authority. The gender aspects of pirate justice were complicated by the overwhelmingly male composition of most pirate crews. The few women who did serve on pirate ships, such as Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read, were generally subject to the same legal codes and procedures as their male counterparts, though some crews had special provisions governing relationships between crew members and issues related to the presence of women aboard ship. The egalitarian treatment of the few female pirates was remarkable for its time and reflected the broader commitment to equality that characterized pirate society. However, the rarity of female crew members meant that pirate justice systems had limited experience dealing with gender-related issues, and that their approaches to such matters remained underdeveloped compared to other aspects of their legal codes. The medical aspects of pirate justice included provisions for dealing with crew members whose criminal behavior might have been influenced by illness, injury, or mental incapacity. Some pirate codes included specific procedures for handling cases where defendants might not have been fully responsible for their actions due to medical conditions. The limited medical knowledge of the 18th century meant that these provisions were relatively crude by modern standards, but they demonstrated an awareness that justice required consideration of factors beyond simple criminal intent. Pirates who had suffered head injuries in battle, for example, might receive more lenient treatment if their subsequent behavior could be attributed to their medical condition. The educational impact of pirate justice extended beyond the immediate crew members to include the broader maritime community and even to influence legal development on land. Stories of fair treatment aboard pirate ships spread throughout the sailor community and contributed to demands for better treatment and more democratic procedures in legitimate maritime employment. Some maritime labor organizations adopted practices that were clearly influenced by pirate precedents, including collective bargaining procedures, democratic decision-making processes, and systems for sharing profits more equitably among crew members. While these legitimate organizations could not adopt the violent methods of pirates, they could, and did, learn from pirate innovations in democratic governance and fair treatment of workers. The documentation and preservation of pirate legal codes has provided modern scholars with invaluable insights into the actual operation of 18th-century democratic institutions. Unlike many other historical communities, pirates took care to write down their laws and to preserve records of important legal proceedings, creating an unusually complete picture of how their justice systems actually worked in practice. These historical records have proven particularly valuable for understanding the practical challenges of implementing democratic ideals in small communities under stress. The successes and failures of pirate democracy provide lessons that remain relevant for modern democratic institutions and for contemporary efforts to create fair and effective legal systems. The legacy of pirate justice extends far beyond its historical significance to influence modern thinking about law, democracy, and community governance. The pirates' demonstration that fair and effective legal systems could be created by ordinary people without formal legal training has inspired various movements for legal reform and community-based justice initiatives. The emphasis on collective decision-making, transparent procedures, and proportionate punishment that characterize the best pirate justice systems continues to influence discussions about criminal justice reform, restorative justice programs, and alternatives to traditional punitive approaches to crime and punishment. As we reach the end of our exploration of pirate justice, it becomes clear that these outlaw communities created legal systems that were, in many respects, more fair and democratic than the legitimate institutions of their time. Pirates faced the fundamental challenge that confronts all human communities: how to maintain order and resolve disputes while preserving individual dignity and community cohesion. Their solutions were not perfect, and they operated in circumstances that were unique to their time and place. However, the principles they developed, democratic participation in lawmaking, transparent procedures, proportionate punishment, and collective responsibility for justice, remain relevant and valuable for anyone seeking to create fair and effective legal institutions. The punishments that pirates imposed were often brutal by modern standards, but they were administered according to rules that every crew member had helped to create and that applied equally to all. The transparency and predictability of pirate justice stood in sharp contrast to the arbitrary and often corrupt legal systems that governed legitimate society in the early 18th century. Perhaps most remarkably, pirates demonstrated that people from vastly different backgrounds, different races, nationalities, religions, and social classes could come together to create effective systems of democratic governance and fair justice. In an age when most societies were rigidly hierarchical and when legal systems reflected and reinforced social inequalities, pirate crews created communities where every voice was heard and where justice was administered according to principles of equality and fairness. To break the pirate code was to risk your life. For pirates, justice wasn't just law. It was survival. But it was also something more. It was proof that ordinary people, even those rejected by respectable society, could create extraordinary institutions based on principles of equality, democracy, and mutual respect. The legacy of that achievement continues to inspire and instruct us more than 3 centuries after the last great pirate cruise sailed the Caribbean seas, reminding us that the quest for justice is a fundamental human drive that transcends the boundaries of law and respectability, and that sometimes the most important innovations in human governance come not from palaces and parliaments, but from the rough democracy of desperate men, who discovered that their survival depended not on the arbitrary will of tyrants, but on the collective wisdom of free people choosing their own path toward justice.